If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who isn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm going to get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's going to happen to you?
What?
You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It's my pleasure to have the co-hosts of Myth of the 20th Century, a provocative podcast. So, folks, introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Adam.
I'm Hank.
And I'm Nick.
Okay, Adam, Hank, and Nick. So this podcast, I started listening to it about a year ago, and I know it kind of covers a broad swath of history, particularly, the 20th century, of course. But you cover anything from, movies, or perhaps a book that you read, or an event like the Spanish Civil War, or say the Holodomor, or Watergate, Nixon, or the CIA. The Leo Frank trial and these things. So you cover a lot of ground. And my first question to you all be, why did you start doing this? What was your motivation to starting this program? And what is your program all about? What's its main focus? What is its purpose?
Well, I could say Nick and I kind of were talking about this together before this all started about, what are we going to do? We kind of came from, as we were talking before the show, a little bit from the libertarian world, and we sort of got disillusioned with that as the libertarians never seemed to be able to obtain power. And we obviously were galvanized a little bit by the momentum behind the Trump campaign, and we were talking to a lot of people in the dissident right sphere, but we noticed there wasn't too much going on in terms of deep analysis about all these sort of assumptions that we're taught as Americans in our classrooms and on the television and movies about and for me, I can say that growing up, America's never been the same for me since 9/11, and it's just a series of lies and deceptions and disappointments ever since then. And I've been very disillusioned with any authority in the country. And I've no longer put any faith or trust in universities and institutions of a intellectual authority that were previously considered to be the sources for the information about our country, our history, our community, and sort of a deep analysis and analytical framework that is supposed to prepare us, to deal with the world. And I found that in my own life, it's just it's misprepared us, and it's sort of helped the country become under the under the realm of very powerful people that don't seem to have the interests of most of the people in their hearts. And so I've become motivated to learn this stuff myself, and I've met people like Nick and Hank and our other co-hosts to try to just help each other. And we've been pleasantly surprised to find that there's a lot of people out there that are actually wanting to know some of the truth, hopefully, that we're uncovering, that is just not taught to us and actually is mistaught to us on purpose, it seems.
If I recall correctly, I believe the genesis of the show was at a cigar bar. Right?
Without giving away the location, there was a good location that we thought we could sort of meet privately in the back of a very cool, like, smoking lounge / wine bar. And we met up with a few people who all weren't there in person, but we had a few connections over the phone, and we started hashing out things like, what is the deep state? And I remember this, Nick. You said that term. I didn't even know what it was, and it wasn't too long after that Sean Hannity started using it. So when I met Nick, I thought this, and he's a fairly young guy, but I was impressed by the knowledge that he had that wasn't mainstream, and so I wanted to continue conversations like that. And I thought, well, we might as well just record some of it and see what happens.
Yeah, I've spent most of my life involved in various
having a bad week with the internet, so sorry.
Hopefully I can get that.
So this is Hank?
Yes, I'm
okay.
Hank.
Okay, so where Nick reconnects, what's your story?
Well, so I have the same kind of, it's almost a stereotypical ex-libertarian background. And I actually was very enamored of Obama because I thought that he would actually go in and clear house. And as it became clear that he was co-opted by a lot of the same kind of permanent governance, administrative class elite, it sort of also became clear that there were a lot of really odd structural issues with American politics and society and governance and economics. And I just sort of started digging deeper and deeper into it. And by the kind of last half of the Obama years, it was fairly well radicalized, and a lot of the kind of structural analyses of American society and power had led me to believe that a lot of what we have right now as our kind of baseline understanding of historical events is not in any way kind of connected to reality. It's like when you read the Iliad, like, sure, there was some kind of a Trojan War, but you're reading like a campfire story that was designed to be entertaining. And when you go through kind of the mainline view of contemporary American history of the 20th century, what you're getting is a finely tuned combination of national myths and outright propaganda and deception. And, hopefully we can kind of counteract some of that on our show.
Yeah, of course, the antidote to this is just sort of deconstructing these things and entertaining counter narratives and other, the other side, so to speak, or the multiple sides that are part of these events, because these are complex events that we're talking about, and there's multi layers.
Yeah,
to
I
them.
mean,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that was kind of mind blowing, like if you kind of had a connection to libertarian blogs, in the kind of odds time frame, there's a lot of crossover with the rationalists, and they had this kind of notion of you have an intellectual Turing test. Like, can you actually describe what some horrible person was trying to accomplish when they did something horrible? And if you can't, then that says more about your own kind of lack of capacity and your own state of mind. than it does about whatever you purport to describe. So unless you can give an explanation for things like, what were various German factions trying to do in the 1930s? Like, what was Stalin actually trying to accomplish? You really can't understand things like, what was FDR trying to go about? Like, what was Lincoln really this kind of sainted figure? What compromises was he making? And what was sort of traded off in all of these endeavors?
Yeah, was Lincoln really 25 feet tall? Because when I go to the memorial, he's very tall, even though he's sitting down, right? So, that's history.
Yeah, that monument in particular is truly like the most imperial thing in Washington D.C. It literally like overlooks the entire mall, and he's just looming on his throne above the newly formed American Empire. It's
supposed to be Apollo's temple, isn't it? Do I have that right?
Well, it's like like a Parthenon or something, right?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me right now?
Oh, you're back. Okay, there you are. Hey.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, he towers over Jefferson, even though Jefferson is standing and he's sitting. So there's some symbolism there, I suppose.
Well, I've often told this to people, but the Jefferson Memorial is I don't know if it's intentional, but it truly is kind of in a hidden corner of the mall, because you have to walk over a bridge to it. And I actually walked around the city one day just on my own. Took the whole day. I just didn't want to take a cab. I wanted to see everything myself, and I was too tired to get there. I mean, and I imagine most people don't even bother, but it's quite ironic that he's one of the founders, so to speak, and he's kind of shoved off in the corner.
So, Nick, I'm sorry, your connection seems to be better now. So, your participation in the show.
Oh, sure. I've been involved in all kinds of different fringe politics stuff for years, and had some interest for a while in sort of maybe you could say the conspiracy world. I would prefer the term power elite analysis. And one thing that I found is that there's a lot of things that if you're not coming from, generally speaking, the right, that you miss and you'll fail to understand when attempting to do, power elite analysis. I mean, for example, I know you've had E. Michael Jones on a lot, and E. Michael Jones points out the ways in which, pornography and sexual liberation, etc., are tools of political control. And that's something that if you're, an ideological libertarian, you're never going to be able to wrap your head around.
Yeah, he makes the point that Michel Foucault's conversion to sexual libertinism and degenerate behavior, that was a way of co-opting the left and seducing them with sexual liberation to enslave them, because they get, you get distracted with all the sex, right? And that's what modern entertainment is all about now, isn't it? So.
Yeah, I mean, men who are ruled entirely by their passions can be controlled easily.
Yeah,
that's the idea, and he's quite right. And I'd say there's a bunch of other little things that pop up in sort of, race is very important to understanding power dynamics as well. Of course, Zionism is another key issue. These are, I think that what we try to do, or at least what I try to do, is do sort of maybe a merger of Peter Dale Scott and Francis Parker Yockey is kind of where I'm coming from.
Okay, so the myths of the 20th century.
There's a couple layers to our show title. Obviously, you do have the play off of Alfred Rosenberg's famous Turgid book, and it is a 20th century focused show. But we do try to debunk or, myth bust, I guess you could say. But also we acknowledge that myths are bigger than, just lies. A myth is it's a narrative that filters how people understand and their world.
It's a cultural touchstone for a society that it's sort of like a Hank taught me this term, but it's sort of a shelling point that people kind of maybe not like, unconsciously, pursue, but it's basically something that people have in common, and they can speak to each other using these concepts. And so I think the biggest myth, and we were asked this on our sort of quiz show, what is the sort of kind of mythology of the United States? And since the end of the World War, in my opinion, it's been the United States is the bastion and champion of freedom and democracy for the entire planet. And that is so sort of broad and grand sounding that you can almost define it in any way. But I think in practical terms, what it's turned into is basically it's the justification that the military and DC establishment uses to impose its version of empire throughout the world, whether it's the military bases or the free trade or the political homogeneity that it pushes for with these orange revolutions or whatnot in foreign countries, and expansion of NATO, the homogenization of the consumer culture with the expansion of McDonald's and Apple, the media. It's basically a form of empire, and it's a very sophisticated one that uses the system of psychology that had never really been used before to, I guess, get people to think that they're not even part of the empire, but they are, in effect, because the U.S. dollar is the standard. The global U.S. naval fleet patrols the oceans even more than the British ever did. And it's a culture that people share without even realizing it. So it's really a myth that all people around the planet have come to sort of become indoctrinated in. And it's really astonishing how it works. And I would say without Hollywood and without the sort of just sheer size of the U.S. economy, it probably would have never happened. But with the technology that has come out in the 20th century, it's become this thing that people just unconsciously work around. And people want to come to the United States to be American because they see all the portrayals of these amazing things in these movies. And whether or not it's true, it doesn't matter, because the United States gets to select from basically a big portion of the elite of foreign countries, deprive them of their elite, and then reincorporate them into the sort of champions of the empire. And they're even sometimes the biggest champions of the empire, even more than the native people are, because the native people have seen the hypocrisy of the so-called American dream. So it almost needs these foreigners to come in, whereas before empires would just conquer people explicitly, whereas this is more of a psychological conquering, and you're not even aware of it, which I think is the most insidious part of the American system.
Is that borrowed from the British with Oxford and the Rhodes Scholarship and these things, sort of this psychological conquest, which facilitates the physical conquest?
Well, we certainly learned a lot from them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure there's a lot going on there. And a lot of people think that basically, and I'm by no means original in saying this, but basically the Second World War ended the British Empire, and there were people smart enough to know that they needed to shift some of their power base around the world to somewhere that was more secure, and I think that was the United States. So there's people who call it the Anglo Empire, Anglo-American Empire, the Anglo-Zionist Empire.
Yeah.
There's lots of names for it. But it's basically NATO and then all the sort of other countries that are sort of still being sort of like vied over by China now, but still a little bit around the sphere of Russia. There's still contention there.
I think there's
the myth is.
Oh, go ahead, Nick.
Well, I was going to say that one of the main myths of America is that it doesn't exercise power in wars of conquest and that sort of thing. It's police actions and wars for human rights and responsibility to protect and that kind of stuff as the typical mask for American imperial conquest.
Yeah, the four freedoms, right? That FDR talked about.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that was a good talking point for about a couple years.
And before that, it was the 14 points, I guess. And
that famous the famous Americana illustration of the working man in his denim jacket who's not afraid to stand up.
Oh yeah,
in his New England town hall meeting, and all the businessmen sitting around him, looking respectfully, wanting to hear the common man's opinion. Yeah, that's.
Mr. Smith goes to Washington.
It has like the highest contrast ratio between like the effectiveness of that propaganda, its place in the kind of American self-conception, and then the brutal clash with reality, if that should, by some unforeseen circumstance, be allowed to happen.
Yeah, the reality was the Ludlow massacre, right? Yeah.
Well, the reality is that working man no longer has a job on Monday. His daughters are forced into borderline prostitution, and his sons become the kind of more morose variety of neat.
Mm-hmm.
That's the the unfortunate reality of that particular form of participation in our political process, which is why we're all still anonymous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah.
Maybe we could talk about that. I mean, I don't know if Tim Kelly is you, on your social security card, or you are an alias, but we've chosen not to use our names. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you come across people, and because I've listened to your show for a while, and I have to give you credit, by the way, for working on projects that we're also passionate about. I think what we're unique about is that we have kind of a bigger group that we all kind of argue with each other about, which I think is an interesting format. But when we talk to, I don't know, what do you guys say? Like half the people that we interview use their real names. I couldn't really tell you off the top of my head better than that. But I think the younger people use pseudonyms more than the older generation. And I think that's probably because the America that the older generation grew up in was a little bit more trusting. That's just my assumption. But what do you think, Tim? I mean, do you have any opinion on this? Because some people don't think it's a good idea to use pseudonyms.
Well, it's a thing. It's obviously with the phenomenon or the trend of doxing, and sort of this ostracism that we have in America. If you voice an opinion that's goes against the official narrative of things, so there's good reason because people get harassed. And of course, in some countries, you're jailed for talking about some things that are ostensibly free countries. My view is I don't. Everyone knows their own situation, what risk they have. So I'm not going to judge someone if they decide to remain relatively anonymous. And on the other hand, I like to think that this whole idea of the media is letting a lot of voices speak, no one being big enough to individually matter. So you never get the knock on the door. We hope that's
true.
Yeah, you never get the knock on the door, or your car blows up or something. These things do happen to people who do. I mean, political assassination or the convenient deaths of journalists that have created that have
Michael Hastings.
Michael Hastings is one.
Gary Webb.
Danny
Casolaro.
Go on. And when a journalist dies in Russia and everyone blames Putin, and that's Russia. It happens there. After all, this isn't Spain, right? As they said in The Man for All Seasons. But obviously, if we live in I think when you're talking about we live in a country that's supposedly free with the illusion of freedom, how most people can voice their views and not fear a knock at the door, but they will lose their job, or if they have any position of notoriety or authority or responsibility, they have to tote the corporate line about certain things. Whether it's the issue of Jewish power, or some of the cultural issues like the homosexual rights movements, LGBTQ, STURXY, WXYZ, whatever. I mean, the further you go up the corporate ladder, bureaucratic ladder, if you're in government, you start to have to sort of just accept these things or not say anything about them. So is that really freedom? Because I don't want to say anything because I'll lose my job, and then and that's
in a complex society. I mean, you're always going to have conflict with other people in the society. There's no way around it. I heard this. I can't remember right now, but it was a good point about America's sort of legacy as sort of the one true libertarian, foundationally based country. I think that has nothing to do with the Constitution, to be honest. I think it had more to do with the fact that it was just an empty continent that had a lot of good land and had a few people in it that were not very technologically advanced to fight the invaders off. And the fact that the West started in as far east as Ohio should tell you that the United States was a frontier for hundreds of years. And so people really just didn't have the eyeball of Sauron staring at them for very long, or until recently. I never seen the movie, but one of my high school friends would always talk about this movie. I think it was called like the How We Conquered the West or something like that. It was like a 70s movie.
Oh, How the West Was Won. It was a TV series.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was it. And it sort of ended with like a bunch of like traffic jams and just, a bunch of urban congestion on the West Coast. And that kind of sums it up. I mean, basically we had all this freedom because it was just an empty place and people weren't really up in each other's stuff that much. I think when you get a lot of, especially as the model of America sort of grows based on a lot of immigration and just very confused cultures overlapping one another, you're going to have this inevitable tightening around some sort of core ideology that somehow tries to meld everybody together and then doesn't allow people to differentiate themselves from that because it is harmful for business, as I like to say, whether that's the political objectives or the economic objectives of the ruling elite. So I think that's just a historical legacy of just a very new country. That's sort of my sort of realpolitik analysis of how we even have the concept of libertarianism in this country.
It's sort of like the Frederick Jackson Turner thesis, the frontier, closing of the frontier.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's inseparable from the notion. I mean, if I had to pick a canonical kind of myth of the 20th century, I would say that it's the myth of the United States as kind of a unitary society as opposed to an incredibly factional society where you have kind of an Anglo-Zionist elite, more Zionist than Anglo currently, who essentially operates as an internal colonial power. And, this has kind of historical, economic sourcing behind it. When the frontier was open, there was a tremendous selection effect where you had every manner of, Scotch-Irish borderline savage coming to the United States to settle that frontier. And that's had long-run knock-on effects on the composition of certain areas of the society. And as, economic forces have switched the kind of power base from this kind of Jeffersonian yeoman farmer ideal to a very industrial and then purely kind of abstracted financial commercial elite that's concentrated in these large cities, you've seen a corresponding shift in kind of how American society is structured. But there's still an enormous population of people who fundamentally have kind of a libertarian ethos that's in some sense inborn. There's some areas of the country that are significantly more conformist than the others, and I don't think that that's completely attributable to just things like urban-rural splits or population density or how long they've been on this continent.
Yeah, this country was, it used to be in fact, when it was originally set up, it was very decentralized, but there's been a constant trend or program to centralize it. That was right out of the beginning when they created the U.S. Bank, and then you have the various wars. Of course, Mr. Lincoln's war against the South and these things, and this kind of I think there's no coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence that right after the South's defeated, you have a rise of the American oligarchy, and you have the concentration of industrial power, of course, in the north and the east and these things. But leading into the 20th century, you'd still had regional character or interest, and that's why you had the phenomenon like the American First Committee in the late 1930s or early 1940s, which represented the Midwest, which was agrarian and manufactural, versus the financial interest in the East, which really controlled the situation. That was the opinion that mattered. The Eastern Seaboard elite and the Anglophile elite, and also and their ties to London, and also, although it was just beneath the surface, Jewish power in the United States too at that time was coming into its own. When that was smashed after World War II, which is probably the last gasp of the old republic. Would you agree?
Oh, I would say that the republic probably died. In my mind, there's about 4 kind of American constitutional regimes. There's kind of the depending on how finely you want to slice it, but there's the kind of original constitutional republic. There's the post-Lincoln republic. There's the post-FDR republic, and there's kind of our, kind of emergent Cold War deep state.
It's sort of like post-Patriot Act. I mean, we're kind of living in this new techno. What did Zbigniew Brzezinski call it? The technotronic age. I think that's kind of becoming a fourth era, perhaps.
Yeah, you kind of capture in the screenshot of your show when you have that scene from Dr. Strangelove, the big round table.
Sure.
Now, I don't know
the first person to actually explicitly know or tell us what he knows what that is, but exactly.
No fighting in the war room,
gentlemen. There'd be no fighting in the war room. Sort of the just sort of high tech insanity of it all, right?
Yeah.
So. Obviously, but something in America is a strange creature. I think Adam, you once described it sort of as a Masonic Frankenstein monster in one of your shows, and I thought
I've used that term a couple times. Yeah,
and
I don't see America any other way. I mean, it's really kind of a polyglot empire that was stitched together with some confusing ideology and a lot of hamburgers. So that's about it.
Well, it's the New Atlantis, right? As it was foreseen by, was it Francis Bacon? But
it's Francis Bacon.
But it's kind of one of the myths is I guess you could say one of the big myths of America is that its strength is that it's pluralistic, right? Out of many.
That's literally like a 1960s era invention. I mean, you can have myths that are relatively recent but still completely dominant. But the notion of I don't think the phrase "diversity is our strength" appears anywhere pre-1970.
Wasn't that an ADL creation or something?
Something like that. I mean, the whole nation of immigrants thing was a direct 1960s invention. But the expression now I've furiously got to try to back up, or my mouth has run ahead of me here. But I'm fairly sure that that particularly Orwellian slogan, many of your listeners are probably much older than that expression.
Well, that's kind of funny because you're getting into myths of the 20th century, and then you get into history and then historiography. And if you're familiar with older histories, how certain events are interpreted differently, and the interpretations are adapted to contemporary political agendas. A good example is the interpretation of the so-called American Civil War. Slavery becomes a big issue of that war, the issue of that war, around the 1950s and 60s when you had the Civil Rights Movement. Good example is the creation of the Holocaust narrative, which develops after the Six-Day War here in the United States, becomes popularized in the 1970s, and people who know the history of that. Ron Unz has done a series of articles. He just had one posted recently.
So fantastic.
Yeah, American Pravda, I think it's called, and there's a very long piece, we're having it finished, talking about sort of the historiography of the Holocaust and Holocaust denial. Sort of interpretation of that event, what really went on. But that's an example, again, of a contemporary political movement or ideology taking history and warping it, so they can use it for their own particular purpose.
And you see this with a lot of events. Like, even if you look at things like early Christianity, like if you look at even something kind of as beaten to death as that, like, it's clear that that wasn't a kind of linear project. It was, kind of a reconstruction of events that happened, 30 or 40 years earlier, in many cases.
Mm-hmm.
But this kind of like near past retconning, it can really only happen when the people who actually experienced the initial event are actually all gone or
Yes.
irrelevant.
Yeah.
Like, if you actually have, people who directly participated in World War II still walking around, then it's very difficult to mythologize it as this glorious good war that we sort of won without consequences.
But they seem to have done a fairly good job at that. Wouldn't you agree, Hank?
Oh, yeah, I mean, contemporaneously, but that really only started to kind of catch on when the boomers were fully ensconced in positions of power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Tim.
Oh yeah, there was a purge because around the 1990s, I started to read things like Charles Beard or Harry Elmo Barnes. Come across these books, Chamberlain's book, America's Second Crusade, and you start to realize it's a completely different view that you just don't get through both left and right. The conservative movement was co-opted by Bill Buckley into the Cold War agenda, and what was purged from the right, it just became the old right, and his job was to purge that from respectable opinion. And so if you were reading magazines and National Review or the New Republic and these things, you're getting a very narrow interpretation, well within the arena of the empire. And there's a rich literature contradicting this that people simply weren't aware of. And this is something where the internet has really played a big part in. It could, like you said the IRS. Although I do think the internet is a largely function of control, cybernetics, of tracking everybody. At the same time, it's given us the ability, to have this conversation right now. But also, it allowed me to avail myself a lot of information, which really fundamentally changed my interpretation of history. Although even before internet, I was getting very skeptical. Right, in the 90s when the Cold War ended and NATO expanded. So
Yeah,
Right,
that's
the
to
amount of-
your great credit. I mean, I don't know. Sorry, Hank, but just real quick, I don't know how hard it must have been in the pre-internet era to actually discover the truth, let alone find other people who are seeking that truth in an age when all the distribution was centralized.
Oh yeah, I mean, here's a funny thing, personal story. I was in a Catholic bookstore. This was like 1999, 98, and I ran into the book FDR's Backdoor to War on the shelf. And so, what's this doing here? It turns out the guy liked the book. He decided to sell it. He said, And so I read this book, and this was the first real analysis of U.S. diplomacy towards Japan, provocative diplomacy towards Japan, and right up to Pearl Harbor. And then, of course, in the ensuing years, George Victor's book came about Pearl Harbor. You had that other one come out in the early 2000s about Pearl Harbor. Of course, dating back, I think it was Toland who first talked about, at dawn, it was at a betrayal at dawn or something, or about Pearl Harbor.
And there was Stinnett's book.
Yeah, that's what Stinnett was the other one.
Day of Deceit or something?
Day of Deceit, yeah. And so I read these books, and then you realize, there was Percy Greaves who was writing about this, who was kind of like brushed aside, Just recently, I think his widow republished the book about that. But that fundament, to me, when you read something like Pearl Harbor and FDR's duplicity, the treason behind it, really the betrayal, it fundamentally shifts, changes your perception of that war leading up to it, and of course, subsequently, what other events have you been lied to? Of course, then the other things, of course, the JFK assassination, RFK assassination, the assassination of the '60s, and the deceit leading into the Vietnam War and Korea, and these things, and you start to get kind of a general idea that it's all BS. So.
Yeah, well, I would agree with Hank that the good war wasn't really the so-called republic. I think was already long dead, but it was around that time was the death of the old American right. People. That's when those works and ideas began to be lost. The Harry Elmer Barnes, and you had a few of these people still sticking around, like what was his name, Colonel McCormick, for instance. And the paleocons,
editor of Chicago Tribune or something.
Yeah, paleocons kept some of this stuff alive, and that's how I came into contact with a lot of those books and people like Thomas Fleming, and you had Pat Buchanan as sort of the last heir to the intellectual legacy of what was the old American right.
Yeah, there was a Chronicles magazine, which I subscribed to in the 90s, and some of these names started popping up, and Pat Buchanan actually have revived it in the 90s for the reasons I stated earlier, was this sort of this discomfort of what's going on. It was, hey, the Cold War's over. Why aren't we, disbanding NATO and slashing the budget and these things? Something's going on here. And I started to subscribe to Chronicles magazine, which was edited by Thomas Fleming, and you'd read these articles that you just wouldn't read anywhere else. And that's the first hint I got of some of these other views, And it wasn't an overnight conversion. It was like, I'll, food for thought, put it away, put it on my shelf, and think about it. So,
did you ever go to a conference before the internet? I mean, you could probably say you've gone to a conference at some point, but what I'm getting at is, what was the dynamic like if you had gone to one of those conferences before the internet between the people? Because that at that time it was much more difficult to form those connections versus now, and so
yeah,
I'm wondering if that was it probably wasn't sufficient, but. What was the dynamic like? And I'm asking this because I'm worried that the internet's going to get increasingly censored. I just don't know how easy it is in the future for us to do what we're doing now.
Yeah, well, everything was very controlled. I mean, I'm looking. You had it was right and left. It was Reagan versus Carter. These things, and that's what my background. I came up, from a conservative Republican background. And I guess for the liberal Democrats it would be the same way. But again, it was these little. You would get these. What it was newsletters, right? Or these things, and the newsletters, whether it's like you were saying in your Q&A, I forget who it was. I think it was Hank who talked about how it was through these newsletters you'd only get really good news. Information you could trust. It was like because it was financial and therefore it was dispassionate and it was objective and these things. But you'd get and of course, to their credit, even some of the stuff coming out of Lyndon LaRouche's thing at the time, I thought was nuts. But then I do a little research.
he is kind of a strange guy.
He is.
The fact that George Bush, H.W. Bush, tried to have him assassinated or something slightly less severe than that, but at least take him out of the process, makes me like him more.
Yeah.
So
but then you read like Dope Incorporated, and you start to learn about the drug trade and the intelligence agencies. The involvement of international, narcotics trafficking in the financial system, and this builds empires, and this they can use this as a weapon to destroy countries like China, or even certain neighbors here in the United States. I think is going on now. It's a part of gentrification and these things, eventual gentrification. But and you hear Gary Webb and this stuff, and Gary Webb's accounts. Although Gary Webb didn't connect those dots, he did kind of make the connections where you start to see patterns and. The use of drugs and banking and these things, and you realize, wow, when Lyndon LaRouche said that the biggest drug kingpin in the world is the Queen of England, you're like, well, yeah, but then if you think about like history and the Opium Wars and British Empire, that's not a crazy statement. It's
he's sort of like anti-Anglo-ism, if that's a term, is a little bit strange. Like I get his sort of claims, but why he sort of pins everything on the Queen of England, so to speak, is what makes him a little bit less credible. And he should probably change that. But whatever, he's a interesting guy. I would recommend anybody check out some of his theories. And also, other than the fact that he thinks like the world will be saved by building a trans-Siberian to Alaskan railroad, I think he has some good economic ideas. But
he's a little bit like Webster Tarpley in that regard.
Yeah, I don't know, but he just kind of like is like, let's not make this, neo-mercantilist, or it's not even that. It's like this. He pins it on the British again, but he basically sees the British Empire system as what the Americans are doing in this global trade system, and he thinks that basically most nations should develop a little bit more separately so that they can have a little bit more balanced social structure rather than just these huge extremes where you have the extreme elite of the world basically all pooling their resources together to basically, it's a loaded term, but sort of like enslave the rest of the planet with owning all the capital. I mean, I sound like Marx at this point, but it's not completely true or wrong when you see the extent to which global capitalism has gotten, where you've literally outsourced all the world's, or a lot of the world's manufacturing to China. There's one place that seems to have just the lock on being slightly more efficient than everybody else. And therefore all the capital floods there. And the guy who you sat next to in high school, who was pretty good and probably was very promising in this sort of very local classroom structure, suddenly is competing with 6 billion people now, and he just can't get a job. And so I think that system is very dehumanizing. And I think that's sort of his thesis, too. It's like you need to have a more national system that is focused on a little bit more the worker and not so much on the capital. But anyway, he's kind of often overlooked, so I'd recommend people look at him.
Yeah, I mean, he gets into, this is the importance of understanding the flow of capital and how it can be directed and manipulated, obviously through the manipulation of banking. Central banking, some people get capital, others don't, right? Other people get the money faster or get financial intelligence, like a George Soros.
Well, it goes to where it can make the most money.
Yeah.
And if giving all the capital to automated factories makes you the most money, then you're going to do that in our system. And therefore, all the auto workers are out of work. All the people who used to even be designers, I mean, they're automating so much now with AI. And Hank can push back at me on this, but I don't see the trend being our friend in this case, where previously people who had relatively advanced degrees were securing fairly good jobs. Now you have to get your 4th, 5th, and 6th degree, and you're still being outcompeted by people coming in from China and India, who come from the highest caste of those societies. And so it's just a glut of capital, basically. And so
yeah, I mean, I think that overstates the extent to which kind of natural economic forces are at the roots of all these things. Like, I mean, honestly, when people talk about being quote unquote outcompeted by immigrants from various countries, there are enormous amounts of resources burned on bringing those people in and making them into a self-perpetuating part of the American economic system. And it's not sort of a rational accountant sitting there with his Excel spreadsheet trying to figure out, well, the Cambodians are, they do half as good of work, but they cost a quarter as much. So Cambodia is our sourcing now. It's a network of personal interactions, of real estate agents, of job brokers, of college roommates, and it's not particularly well set up even for the kind of putative goals of just raw economic performance. And it's becoming increasingly fragile as well, as more of these technological systems kind of concentrate on optimizing for particular things, or kind of, even burning every available kind of surplus. Not necessarily in some kind of, Landian hyper economic extractive sense, but just on, we make X amount of profit, so that's Y number of diversity consultants or recruiting drives for underserved communities or what have you that we can engage in. As soon as you have an actual systemic shock, these things don't collapse as neatly as they were built up.
I think that the capitalist dogmatism of the American right, in particular, is one of the main reasons that they're so bad at power elite analysis and so uninterested in it. I mean, most of the best, the man who was best at it was, of course, James Burnham. And he came. It's not a coincidence that Burnham was once a Marxist, and he's somebody who is willing to look at politics in a way that is unfamiliar to a lot of the kind of stuff you would see in something like the National Review. And part of the reason that they hate him. But I think if you go to like people such as Peter Dale Scott, or you mentioned the nexus of the international drug trade and the deep state, people like Douglas Valentine, they come from the left.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, E. Michael Jones is a very refreshing change in that direction as well, as far as somebody from a very traditional right-wing perspective taking on the things that are normally not touched by the right.
Yeah, like issues like usury, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. The unsustainability of usury. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of coercion in a system that is superficially voluntary. Like the market, right? But if you have intelligence agencies and mercenaries destabilizing developing countries to get access to cheap resources, and then forcing people off their ancestral homelands, farming, and then they go into the cities, and you have the teeming masses in the cities. You have the surplus labor, and all of a sudden you have an area you can outsource a factory to make Nike shoes or soccer balls, because you've had decades, if not centuries, of some of these policies, and it's hard to unravel it. A good example is the industrialized North was fed with the fodder of Irish immigrants coming from Ireland who were being starved to death by British policies, and these people also filled the ranks of the Union Army to crush the South. And it's hard to did they voluntarily go into the factories? No, they had very little options, and those options can be narrowed. And there's a sort of science to coercion, and you can narrow people's options. You can create a situation so desperate that the men have to turn to either drug dealing to make a living, or women to prostitution, and this is what wars do.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that gets back to sort of how America operates. It's the land of the free and home of the increasingly less brave, obviously. And it's just the way this very sophisticated control system works. Is that it teaches people about the horrors of the past, the wonders of progress in the future, and we were taught that slavery was a thing, and aren't we lucky not to have slavery anymore? But people struggle to get out of their mortgage payments, or struggle to change jobs without pay cuts or even finding one, and they struggle to speak their mind. I mean, there's so many things that we're not free to do, and it's not we're in chains, but it's a psychological chain system.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I went to said half jokingly, but I showed up at a family gathering, and my views aren't shared by most of my family members. And my brother says as a joke, says, I have to leave now because you, just by being here, the stock of my company just dropped.
Well, yeah, that's like, I mean, he's joking, but it's just...
The economy is telling you. The economy.
I'm not going to say who this is, but I know someone whose family basically had to ask him to leave because his own son's job was potentially at risk if they found out the views of his father. It wasn't even that he had done anything wrong or illegal or anything like that. He just had the wrong opinions. And it wasn't even the employee, it was the employee's father. How insane a society is that? I mean, it's basically, and again, we're taught, are we lucky not to live in the days of the Salem witch trials? I don't see any difference.
How fragile is your truth if you can't stand, the scrutiny of just skepticism or just another point of view? It's, that's amazing. And yet it happens. I mean, yeah.
What happened to honesty, integrity, forthrightness, and standing, by your principles? I mean, these things were, again, taught to us as what the American ideals were. And I tend to believe it was more true in the past. It probably never was really that ideal a society. But, I can say that, and I feel bad saying this, but I'm sincere when I say it. I respect my grandparents more than my parents' generation, at least, in the generational sense, because they obviously, and it wasn't even their choice, but they went through a lot more hardships, and I think their mindset was much more realistic and grounded than the baby boomers. It's a very common thing to beat up on the baby boomers, and I don't blame them per se. It's just the circumstances again, but it's just those ideals seem to be stronger. In a distant past, if ever.
Well, I think back then you had, and you all can maybe add something to this, perhaps, is you had people who, maybe not the baby boomers, the generation before that, who were more confident about their family background, where they came from, their ethnicity. There was more ethnic consciousness back then. And this defined where they lived. You had Polish neighborhoods, Irish Catholic neighborhoods, German neighborhoods, these things, and this was intentionally smashed in the post-war era, through suburbanization, interstate highway system, and these things, and this is where you get into some other things, understanding the sort of the intrigues or the true motivations behind integration and the civil rights movement, and these things. So they could speak their mind. There's ethnic and community, and because of their ethno-religious identity, they had strong communities. And they could marshal the physical and also the psychological reserves to defend themselves. And this has been destroyed as we become homogenized, into suburbia. We're just consumers, right? And
the primary resistance against forced integration came from European ethnics, Poles, for instance.
Yeah, because
they were some of the few people who were willing to fight.
The Irish in Boston, I think, burned some of the buses they were sending in to their previously Irish-only school districts.
Yeah, and the Southies, and of course they were lambasted in the mainstream press, for these things, because they weren't politically savvy, nor did they appear. They were just working class people, and so they could be portrayed in a certain light. But it was their children that were being bused 2 to 3 hours a day to meet some federal judge's idea of what a racially balanced school should be. Of course, in the process, they also destroyed the schools. And to the extent that you're going to have public schools, they should be locally controlled, because that's the only way you maintain any real quality and accountability. And, this is all, again, this whole thing of integration, it wasn't done integrated. In fact, it created white flight to begin with. And the Boston schools are more segregated than ever, and they're worse than ever because they had to eventually lay off all the quality teachers to satisfy quotas and affirmative action programs and these things. So it didn't even achieve what they said they were going to achieve. Who's surprised, but
yeah, and Nick, in varying degrees, the other guys sometimes push back a little bit on me on this, but I'm fascinated to know all these things, but at a certain point I want to know, what do we do about it? And that's kind of my personal quest in this movement, or whatever it is, to try to come up with stuff that is a little bit more than just sort of a group therapy session, which I think is what a lot of these meetups turn into. And even podcasts. I want us to do better, and I think we can do better. Granted, we have very little power, but I think it's important that we remind ourselves that we have to act and do things that have concrete goals and objectives. And I love to brainstorm about that stuff. I don't have anything specific given our broad conversation, but it's something I think we need to work on a lot and come up with things. I personally think local focus is probably where you should start, and this is where I agree with Nick. He sometimes disagrees with sort of my focus on that, but I do concede that if you just do things that yourself, is benefiting from, if you're becoming more self-sufficient in terms of your source of income or your family's income, that's not really a political solution. I agree. I think it's a building block, and I think that's possibly how we get ourselves out of this, is because I think we're enslaved by a system that is designed to limit our ability to be independent. Look at all the shutdowns with the payment processors recently going on. That is critical to survival in a complex economy. And that goes beyond shutting down somebody's right to speak on a private website or a privately owned website. That is like, can you earn a living to buy groceries? I mean, that is just fundamentally much more of a serious action, and it's happening. And so I think you do need to get off the vulnerability to that type of thing first, in order for you to be able to do more things other than just talking. That's kind of my thinking, my theory behind this. But it doesn't, again, answer the political solution, which I agree with Nick on. So I don't know if, Nick, you have any thoughts on that, but maybe you can jump in.
Well, I think that I back to the problems on the right. I think in addition to the whole capitalist dogmatism, another big issue is the moralism of the right. And that's not to knock moral law or anything like. Say what? I'm sorry, Adam. What was that?
Oh, it wasn't me. It was just the internet.
I was worried I was cutting out there. My point is there is a kind of a that if you do good things will happen for you politically. And getting back to Burnham, the right seems to struggle with the correct Machiavellian understanding of power. And I think there's a lot of people. I mean, look what happened to the Weavers, for instance. At Waco.
Ruby Ridge, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Ruby Ridge. I mean, I just be living well and, having trying to create some kind of community or something to that effect. That's all good stuff, but it can actually make you, ironically, a target politically. And it doesn't necessarily yield political results that are going to help us from not have to deal with DC anymore. I don't know if it's really possible to do that. I think that there's going to need a much bigger solution to the problem. But yeah, Adam and I do go back and forth on that quite a bit.
I think perhaps there is an overemphasis on solutions per se. Like, if we're all being brutally honest, very few people are in a position to even propose solutions, let alone impose solutions. But I think to some extent there is an obligation on everyone's part to make themselves as hard of a target as possible, under the assumption that as things become increasingly disjointed, anyone who even entertains any of these notions, certainly anyone who's as radical as to listen to this podcast, will find themselves to be a target. And the sooner that you make accommodations for that fact, and the more people that realize that other people are making accommodations for that fact, the more room you have to maneuver and to coordinate. So, I mean, this is almost like the paradox that people who successively engage in kind of risky ventures or have overinflated views of their own success end up constituting all of the actual successful people. I mean, if you do this very kind of harsh, rational modeling project where you try to actually figure out, okay, what are all of the plausible routes to victory or defeat, it's likely that you actually miss the actual course of events. And it's even likelier that you kind of meme yourself into kind of a sense of despair or overdose on black pills. So, I mean, I would say operate under the assumption that there will be a happening of some sort of small magnitude of long magnitude, certainly within a year or two of the end of the Trump presidency, whichever manner that ends up taking. But really, there's there's kind of limited things that you can do except for to try to form local power networks in your own area, become increasingly resilient to disruptions, and try to impose maximum costs on anyone who would try to impose costs on you.
Yeah, that I think that goes back to the idea of forming a some type of community of mutual interest, and so I think so it's not worth people's effort to try to come down because the reaction will be so painful. You'll be able to strike back because you're organized at one level or another. However, I was given an example of one way you can sort of reverse course, or at least stay the inevitable, which perhaps life is all about anyway. I was talking to Ian Michael Jones, and he once proposed to the Archdiocese of New York. They had some church property that was vacant. I think it was a former convent, and he proposed that they take this property, renovate it, and create apartments for young families, and offer a low rent, subsidized rent, as a way to reclaim the parish. Because if you take economic pressure off these families, then they can afford to have more children, and perhaps a more stable home environment with one earner family, father earning, mother taking care of the family, these at home and these things. You can revitalize the community and make it sustainable once again. And he was told by the diocese that it just wasn't economically viable because they had some developer offering them a higher price for the property.
That's typical. Yeah,
that's that economic thing, right? Homo economicus, the capitalist mindset.
I've heard the thesis actually proposed for kind of the broader rot in the Catholic community, and I kind of lack enough evidence to ascertain for myself whether or not I believe this, but the explanation at least seems consistent, is that when the Catholic Church started investing heavily in parochial schools specifically, that ended up with them controlling enough kind of side projects besides the actual project of kind of running a church community, that the people who advanced in the church hierarchy were effectively administrators, and the ones who did very well were the ones who were very able administrators, who were able to finagle things like property deals. So that could be, certainly that's a very dispiriting answer to hear. But, I wouldn't necessarily take that as a universalism, rather than, you have particular institutions that are run by particular kinds of people. And if you want a project to get done, you really have to look at the people involved and how they were selected and what their own personal incentives are for the conclusion of that thing.
Well, again, it gets to the point is what's the solution, and sometimes the solution isn't direct. I mean, you don't do it consciously. You do it by forming a family, and then investing in time and money in those children, and building a community. And again, if you don't have a community, the people become atomized. I do a weekly show with Joe Atwell, and he was telling me an anecdote where this is the late 50s, a town in Wisconsin, I think was ethnically Polish, might be Irish, I think. And a guy came in selling, porno magazines, peddling porn into the neighborhood, and they got the men, the fathers formed a posse, found him and beat the hell out of him, and chased him out of town. Right? Now, in order to do that, in order to have that collective consciousness, so to speak, in order to form that posse and do that, you have to know your neighbor and also share values with your neighbor. And that usually requires some sort of ethno-religious identity. And that act wasn't strictly legal, but it was justified. Considering what the courts were doing at the time, it was definitely justified because the courts would have said this is his First Amendment right to go in and corrupt your children. But that's an example of a strong community. But the problem is, in the 20th century, one of the myths of the 20th century is that all communities need to be integrated. We all need to be diverse. And in that diversity, we all lose our identity. We're atomized, and we lack the collective strength, the corporate identity, to defend our rights. And really, when it comes down to it, you can have a paper constitution that says you have all these rights, but if you don't have the physical means and the psychological means to defend your rights, you have no rights at all. And that requires certain things. And given the way human beings are, it requires communities that have some sort of right of exclusion, however unprogressive that sounds, or regressive that sounds. But that's been smashed in the name of equality and justice.
Well, I think I'll speak for everybody here. I think we agree with that. But the big question is how do you go back to that if it's even possible? And I can give examples because some segregation is allowed. It's just it's only if you're non-white you can do that. I mean, I've been in schools where they have ethnic clubs, but and it's a sort of cliche at this point, but the person who tries to form the white club is quickly front page of the local newspaper as being some sort of reincarnation of Adolf Hitler, and they're quickly denied their application. But in places like the Southwest of the United States, there's large, beyond the community, local community, there's large organizations in the Hispanic community, like La Raza. There's the Muslim Brotherhood in the South and the Midwest and places like that. But the white, the ethnic white organizations sort of still linger on, but you're not allowed to form that broadly defined white one. It's not kosher. But what I was actually going to mention as we were talking about ideas for how to resolve our society, which is kind of a grandiose concept if I actually think about that. It's a pretty big task, so it's not easy. But one of the things that came to my mind recently was from the Z-Man. Are you familiar with him, Tim?
No.
Yeah, he's. I'm going to give credit to Ethnarch. He was a guest on our show a couple times, and he pointed him out to me. And I was aware of this guy, but he's an excellent blogger, and he also has a weekly podcast. But he was a guest on Luke Ford's show, who's a fascinating guy. If nobody's ever looked into him. He was born, I think, Seventh-day Adventist, or born into that religion, and then he became Jewish through his own volition. But he's ethnically not Jewish, and so he has this sort of reputation as being kind of an outsider in all perspectives. But he's a fairly intelligent guy, and he has good guests. And so he had Z-Man on for, I think, the first time. And one of the callers who called in was talking about what we were just talking about. He said, what we need to do is we need to focus on the local community. And to be more specific, what he was going to do was he was going to run for local office. And he sounded like a fairly young guy, maybe in his mid to possibly late 20s. So that's no easy task, but it's possible. It's not impossible. And the Z-Man was very, very, very kind of admittedly harsh on him. And he sort of said he felt bad about it, but he was doing it on purpose because he wanted to get his point across. And what his point was that, and he's in his 50s, the Z-Man. So he's talking to a younger fellow. So if he could sort of speak to himself at a younger age, he would have told himself, a lot of these mainstream politics, even at a local level, are really just kind of a waste of your resources, and it's not the best way you can affect change. And what he puts forward as the best way to change things is he wants to affect the culture, and the culture is really dominated by the left right now. It's where the mainstream Hollywood media is obviously oriented towards, and so they still have a dominant cultural power base in the United States. And he says if we could change that, that'll change everyone's minds to the point where we can not have to actually go to such explicit levels of disagreement and conflict. How do you do that is the bigger question. But I think he has some point in that if you can somehow change people's minds, you don't even have to go to battle. Just they'll do it on their own volition. So that was an interesting idea that I heard recently.
The problem that I have with a lot of the decentralization ideas is that oftentimes, I mean, decentralization relies on a very democratic society in the classical sense of the term. People would need to be very engaged because, I don't know if you guys are familiar, he passed away a few years ago, but there was a libertarian police writer named William Norman Griggs.
Oh yeah,
and he found that, I mean, he would always write about these cases of police abuse and the abuses of local city governments. And oftentimes these are some of the most corrupt people in the state. I mean, yeah, sure, at the high levels of D.C., you have a bunch of bastards as well. But it's on local level, a lot of very sadistic and predatory things happen. And I guess it's possible to take one of these institutions over. That politics of that sort's not really my bag, but I'm often wary of decentralist arguments because oftentimes you'll see that they can create a bunch of small little tyrannies.
Yeah, I mean, that gets to kind of the notion of what the incentives and interests are of various actors. Like somebody who is extracting resources from an entire state is happy to grab, a nickel from every person in his 10 million person electorate, whereas your small town cop is stereotypically looking to avenge his high school wrongs. Like that's the particular that's the particular compensation that he personally desires, is just the thrill of power itself. So, I mean, I think the notion of decentralization, it's contextual as far as whether, like, you want some particular avenue of power to be disrupted or not, because that's what we're really talking about. Like, power is incredibly centralized in the modern United States, and it doesn't seem as though this center is kind of strengthening. Things seem to be falling apart at kind of a rapid clip. So, I mean, I think the kind of good rule of thumb is if your local town or your local kind of polity, whatever position you're trying to affect, is something where the differences in those policies actually have concrete effects on people's lives, or if that provides you with the mechanism to engage with elites at a different level, that can be a good avenue to pursue. But I mean, if you're primarily concerned with, we have to stop Afghanistan from being a 2-decade war, then you're not going to get there by running for local city council unless you intend on making kind of a career of politics. And frankly, I don't think that there'll be time for that.
The other thing that I've thought about a lot is the question of the middle class, which is shrinking in the United States, which I also think is why there's a lot more younger people in the dissident movement now, because they're not in the middle class as their parents were. But the main theory is that because of America's great wealth and somewhat of a great wealth distribution that is somewhat even, there is a very strong reluctance to change things. And the real question is, do we allow the system to just kind of continue to go with the trend of having the elites become wealthier and the poor, I guess, just staying on welfare, and then the middle class sliding further into the sort of poor side of things, and however long that takes, and then eventually people will just get fed up and change it? Or do we try to push things in that direction so that we can actually affect change quicker? That's the realistic sort of discussion that's been going on with a lot of people. And how do you do that? I mean, that's another question. But should that be even a goal? I mean, there's the term accelerationism, and I think it has a lot to do with the economy. It certainly would obviously have something to do with crime. People certainly viscerally react to young women getting kidnapped and raped, as was recently in the news. But I don't think anyone really wants to push for that particular thing happening. But I think the economy is really what gets people thinking about change. And obviously, Barack Obama ran on that platform, and he didn't really change anything. But it was during the economic crisis that he got the most steam, I think, and got elected. So there's that theory about the middle class sort of holding back necessary change.
Yeah, I mean, the system used to pay out more, right? Everyone got their beak wet, and that's what keeps everyone content and happy, and they don't want to really know what's really going on. And that's what I come across. A lot of people who consider themselves middle class or upper middle class or successful and respectable is the inability to really just see below the surface and see the level of corruption and violence that's being done in our name, whether abroad or at home. And obviously, if you feel like your job is at stake or your station in life or your standard of living is good enough, you're not going to really challenge the system as long as your belly is full. And our system's very good at feeding people still. And whether it's good for them or not, their bellies are full. And of course, that helps feed the system too, because the more denatured the food or toxified the food, the more money goes into the medical industrial complex. Another form of taxation, perhaps you could say. But it's a problem. How do you alert how do you alert the middle class? How do you get them aware of these things, or even to act or to think about these things? But another time
I'll give the primary one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this was one of the first things that really caused me to re-examine a lot of kind of fundamental precepts that I've been in. Like the modern society is very good at making sure that you have 3,000 calories. I mean, it's very good at ensuring you have 30,000 calories a day if that's what you're really into. But it's abjectly terrible at making sure that you have a girlfriend, which is like one of the kind of fundamental prerequisites to having a stable society is for people to actually have a investment in the continuation of the society. So, I mean, I think that is actually a huge mechanism by which discontent and radicalization brews in contemporary American society.
Is this
I completely agree.
Is this the MGTOW thing you're talking about?
A Gauss thing?
MGTOW, men going their own way.
Oh, MGTOW.
Oh, I mean, I think that's one kind of response, but you see kind of a panoply of like a just complete spectrum. You have the kind of the MGTOW people who try to kind of go their own way, I guess. You have the they're kind of defunct now almost, but the players, the pickup artists who try to kind of gamify or optimize the entire thing away. You have the kind of incel response that kind of self-pathologizes. I mean, there's infinite responses really, but none of them seem particularly healthy because it's not really. It's like, what's a healthy way to deal with leukemia? Like it's not particularly pleasant situation to be in, and anything that you do is sort of a coping mechanism.
Have you familiar with Roger Devlin?
Yes,
oh yes,
absolutely.
His book
He's
Sexual Utopian Power. I read his book. I had and the whole hypergamy, and this was sort of launched by Helen Gurley Brown. This is sort of the effect of feminism. And then the sexual revolution, he makes the point where a lot of people thought with the sexual revolution and the loosening of moral standards in regards to sex, particularly among women, because women are the ones that kind of kept things in check in the market, so to speak. But the idea of liberated women sexually, and his idea is that at the beginning it was sold as if it would mean more sex for everybody. But really what it resulted in is more sex for a few men. and a lot of marginalized other men, because obviously the idea of monogamy, and it's going to one man, one woman, and then they're off the market. Then the women have to go down the pecking order, and this sort of creates that stable situation that you're referring to. And this has been destabilized by sexual liberation, sexual revolution, and its effects, which is sort of this weaponized, or this warped or sort of twisted sense of hypergamy we see among so many women today, and has made them sort of hard to deal with. So you have men who find it harder to earn a living, who are marginalized, who are sort of demoralized, and they're also perverted by pornography, right? This to distort you. And same thing with women. The women have become, I guess, less suited for being homemakers and sort of the wife figure. And this creates this very situation I think you're referring to.
Well, and then there's the issue for pornography for women as well.
Yeah.
Which is not the same as pornography for men. It takes the form of, those trashy dime store novels.
Yeah. Or what was that one where the woman gets tortured for a contract? Shades of Grey.
50 Shades of Grey.
50 Shades of Grey.
More broadly, just like the social media ecosystem more broadly, just kind of like there's a lot of these kind of modern hyperstimuli that trigger all of the same kind of circuits that would be very important in an environment of like 50-person tribe, or even a 5,000 person relatively small town. But now when you have kind of the social affirmation of a million likes on your Instagram account or whatever, it completely disrupts any connection that those signals would have had to your actual success or kind of physical well-being, or your kind of long-term happiness.
How about the? And this is maybe a personal observation. My point is sort of this. This has been a trend long term for a long time, though. Is the normalization of out of wedlock birth. Obviously, this grew out of the from the collapse of the family in the black community, but this has been sort of normalized in the general white population, and how the lack of shame. There is.
I can tell you from my own life that the single mother women that I know are given thumbs up on Facebook, congratulations, come back home, we'll take care of you. Never does anybody ask, where's the father? Isn't it important to have the father in that child's life? Why did you fuck up? What's wrong with you? Like, there's never any of that.
No,
it's all congratulations, great going. You're the best. It's really it's a nightmare, and the women they should know better, and they're not taught anything to tell them otherwise.
This normalization of single motherhood by choice is really, you want to talk about long-term instability. That's it, because I think whatever problems society has, they're aggravated by broken homes or homes that never formed, because these kids are much more likely to suffer physical abuse, sexual abuse, suffer sexual confusion than these things. It's just awful.
Of all these problems, I'm a huge shill for my favorite public intellectual, Nicholas Nassim Taleb, and I think if you could sum it up in one idea, it'd be his idea of skin in the game, and of matching these incentives with disincentives. Mm-hmm. And as you say, traditionally shame would be a way to disincentivize that kind of behavior from women, and that's taken out. And same is true of imperial politics. The people pulling the triggers on these wars have no personal skin in the game. There's no consequences that will be that will fall upon them if things go as they have gone.
Yeah. And the reality is, if you're in a family and it doesn't form, and you're just say vast majority of single parent families are female headed households, and usually they're on some sort of public assistance of one form or another. That family is weak. That community is weak. And little things. There was a story you might have heard this. I've talked about this. I was told a young girl had a kid in school, like in second grade, and he got in trouble because he called his teacher a bad name. So she went into the conference with the principal and the teacher, and it turns out that he had called his teacher a fag. Turns out the teacher is a transvestite.
So he's a fag.
Yes. And so, and the young girl's kind of well intentioned. She's rather clever. She's dealing with she did right. It didn't work out for her. She's just unfortunate. She did do the right thing when she was in this predicament. It just didn't work out for her. But now she's single because her husband didn't step up. But nevertheless, it's a weak, broken family. And she tells the administrator, the principal, and teacher, well, we're a Catholic family and we have certain beliefs. I can't tell them it's right. I can tell them not to call them names. But the reality of the situation is, of all the people in their room, the child was the most sane. Because out of the mouths of the babes, the whole public school system, the institution is there, is malevolent. It's destroying this child, not to mention all the other children, when they're a captured audience to this person who, in a more sane era, would have been confined to the margins, if not a sanitarium. But then he's given authority over 30 students, and no one sees this as wrong. I mean,
that's just an impossible situation.
Yes.
Honestly, it's better almost the earlier that children realize that they're being consistently lied to by authority figures. I'm not necessarily a accelerationist, kind of in all caps, because you're not in a position to determine the way that breaks down. And a lot of the times things are set up so that the costs of failure are imposed first on the people who are least able to bear them. But, I mean, in the context of the school system, the kind of most shocking lie that can be placed in front of a child is, this thing in a dress, that's we're going to call that a woman, and we're all going to be very solemn, and we're going to, everybody looks at each other very carefully to make sure we're all on the same page, and we're going to declare to each other that we're going to agree to call this thing a woman. It's okay, so I can go one of two ways. I can say that the entirety of my brain screaming that this bearded entity, and I can choose to go along with it. I can choose to believe that you all are abject liars for some reason or another, or I can kind of hedge my bets and I can play along and maybe get a little bit smarter about what this entire thing is all about until I figure out what the hell is going on. And
I got to tell you, Bruce Jenner was actually a huge wake-up call for me. And it was the emperor wears a dress and can bench 250. At what point do you really realize your society is Orwellian? So sorry, I had to point that out, because this tranny, we don't call them transvestites anymore for some reason, but transsexual, trans, emerging, whatever the hell they want to be called. I've always noticed this too. It's we need to make everyone in the majority inconvenienced because of the minority. I was, even as a kid, I was sort of confused at the concept of the American Disabilities Act. I was okay, I don't want to hurt crippled people, but why are we spending millions of dollars to put on ramps that I've personally never seen used? And it's a big boondoggle for the construction companies, I guess. But it's that's an example of sort of imposing these costs on people who are not really gaining anything from it. And so it's sort of this disconnect between the incentives again. It's a sort of a skin in the game problem, I guess, but it's we have a very strange society.
At the same time, they passed a law. They don't define what a disability is, so it's a boon to lawyers and endless litigation.
Sure.
What's a disability? You get caught stealing. Well, it's a disability. It's a psychological disorder. You can't fire me. you have those cases. And yeah, you're right. It's this sort of this, you can just, with the legislation, make everything nice again. Of course, behind that, again, is probably lobbyists and construction interests and these things, contractors. The same thing it is, with the school systems themselves. It's all about, largely about brick and mortar contracts, overpriced, commissary or school lunch programs and these things. You know how the school system itself, like our local school system provides breakfast and lunch, hot breakfast, hot lunch for every student, and 90% of the students are on, they're getting a free lunch. I mean, the taxpayers are paying for it. Now, you can't tell me that 90% of the parents could not muster the resources to prepare a sandwich, a bag of carrots. But no, because they assume everyone's indigent and helpless. At the same time, the contractors are cashing in, providing the food.
I got into an argument one time at a grocery store where I was checking out, where a guy came up to me in line, and I was at the last guy in the line, so he comes right behind me and he says, "Hey man, I was wondering if you could help me buy this for dinner." And I look at it, and it's a frozen dinner. It's probably $7, some Hungry Hunter thing that you get out of the freezer section. And I'm like, you want me to buy that for you? First of all, it implies you have a microwave. Second of all, it implies that you're not very good with money. It's probably why you're in this situation to begin with. And you expect me to pay for something that with that $7, you could buy a bag of rice and beans and survive off of that for a week. No, I'm not going to give you money for that. Get the hell out of here. And he oh yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Yeah, but
the Hungry Hunter happens to be the also the price of a discount dime bag. So I wouldn't necessarily assume that there is a connection between the money and the microwavable meal there.
Maybe could have been it.
Yeah. But I mean, the whole thing is much of the welfare system. It's although I think there are some people who are desperate, but it's there. It assumes everyone is helpless. I just remember when I was going to Catholic school in the 70s, my mother would bag a lunch for us. It'd be a sandwich, some vegetables, maybe something to drink, and maybe something else, a treat or something. And it was probably done at a fraction of the cost of what the public school was offering in the cafeteria. Overall, you pay a subsidized cost at the register. I'm saying, what's billed to the school system and the taxpayer, and that the assumption has, we have to provide them a breakfast because parents can't do that, and you have to provide them lunch because parents can't do that either. And this is sort of self-perpetuating because you start to subsidize this sort of irresponsibility. It gets worse and worse and worse, and then you're faced with a situation where look how helpless the parents are, and you subsidize this goes back to the whole.
Well, it's
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say it's the opposite that should be subsidized. What should be subsidized are young families, so that women do not have to go to work in corporate America and they can have more children, and not, rather than subsidizing single mothers and that other various kinds of degenerates.
But you don't think women should be liberated to go work for Federal Reserve notes, where they can be taxed? It's liberation, you see.
Yeah,
they should work for bitcoins.
Jeez, man.
Because there's no value to preparing a meal. There's no value to raising children. There's no value to keeping a relatively nice home environment, for the family.
Well, there's no taxes on it.
That's how do you tax that? You're right.
One of the big reasons.
Yeah.
I had someone on Twitter. I was commenting. I saw you're familiar, of course, with the Jordan Peterson guy.
Mm-hmm.
He was putting something out about how great economic freedom has been for women, and so I responded accordingly. And someone said something to the effect of it's the priority. It's better for women to be economically liberated than for them to have families. I mean, this is what people think.
But how is it liberated? You're just working for a damn salary. You're
exactly.
I mean, it's not. Then they complain about all the hassle they have at work. My boss is a jerk. My boss is sexual. All these things. And again, this is part of this. I mean, I'm going against the zeitgeist. I'm going to sound primitive, but what this has done is this has led to the sort of the brutalization of women and the destruction of proper femininity, which leads to lower birth rates and unsustainability in society itself. But I'm saying, yeah, why? I mean, what do you think you're going out for? And the bottom line is, as Jordan Peterson talks about giving women advice to have careers. The vast majority of women who work don't have careers. They have jobs. They may have 2 jobs. They're not living they're not climbing the corporate ladder. They're making do. And the women that do the climb the corporate ladder end up 40 years old. Then they're looking in their apartment. They're eating a cheese sandwich for dinner, and they're looking at their cat. It's
right. I mean, the problem is they become so successful. There's no good man good enough for them except for the billionaire, and it's just it's one of those problems where the individual is making a group suboptimal. It's almost like a game theoretic issue where individually I want to maximize my own earnings, but in doing so I'm limiting my options in other ways, but the incentives again are sort of like I have to work because otherwise I can't afford where I live, and only the jobs are in the big cities, and so it's just this horrible paradox that people find themselves in. Even if they understand the logic of what we're saying, they really have no choice. And I've experienced this so many times. It's like I'll have a conversation with somebody and they're like, yeah, that makes sense, and then they don't change anything because they can't change anything. It's all sort of talk, and that's what's the most frustrating to me is that we may know something, but that's not going to affect what we need. But I mean, it's a crucial component. Don't get me wrong. You do need to understand these things before you can act. But it's just frustrating once you realize how little power you really have. And again, it's like the average person. I don't blame them for. If you have children and you have a family and you both work, I don't blame them.
Yeah.
It's how the hell else are you going to afford all that stuff? I mean, it's just impossible. And so obviously if you look at the analogy of the individual versus the group problem, before the women just didn't work as sort of a cultural given. I don't know how else to explain it. And so the labor force was much smaller. And so the salary that the man would make because of that was higher. And so he could have an easier time supporting that family. And now he can't because the labor pool is so much larger and that drives the price down. So it's how do you undo that? I don't know. I think some of it is cultural because before people just didn't have their wife working, at least in the corporate world.
Well, obviously it was. They had to change the culture. Just go back to your idea of changing the culture. The culture precedes the political, and you had in the 1960s it started. I think it started with Playboy magazine, and then the reaction to that is feminism. Both of them, I think, I had a CIA backing,
and Rockefeller backing.
Rockefeller backing, the Kinsey. All that's Rockefeller. This gets into the foundations and how the foundations really undermine representative government. How the the foundations will fund a study or a university study that has the air of science to it or academia to it, and then the study gets published and it gets picked up by government, becomes the basis for legislation. The news media picks it up, and lo and behold, it sounds like this great finding has been made by independent thinkers who are scholars. It turns out it's all been controlled at the get-go from the foundation funding, and this you can change the culture this way. You can change it. Obviously the introduction of the pill changed sexual mores or habits, behaviors, but at the same time you have the legitimization of pornography, and at the same time the courts are facilitating. They're destroying the ability of localities or communities to police it. It's becoming, First Amendment right in these things, and the media changes and these things. So the culture changes. At the same time, the macroeconomic situation has changed because in the 1970s, I don't think it's just a coincidence that in the 1970s, when wages started to flatline, that's also when the dollar was decoupled from gold, and so they could inflate. And they brought in the credit card for everybody. So now instead of wages and savings and equity, we're surviving off debt, and this creates pressure on the family, which then legitimizes the culture shift attitude towards women working, because now women have to work because men just aren't cutting it anymore. And this undermines the authority of the male family, which then, but ironically, this seems to sort of coincide with the agenda of the authoritarian personality, which
yes.
So there's high level malfeasance going on here, and a lot of psychological warfare, and social engineering going on. This isn't like a second law of thermodynamics where things are just falling apart. We're being pushed in a certain direction.
What do you think about Agenda 21, Tim?
I'm sorry?
I'm sure you've talked to people about this, but Agenda 21.
Oh yeah, that's
great.
Yeah, I mean, I see it in communities like bike sharing programs, which are a big boondoggle. They're putting bike paths like in roads, and they're not maintaining roads. You're seeing the like the Target communities where you have like above Target, you have the little mini apartments. These things, and this is all being funded, and local initiatives are being funded. And was it Rosa Corey who did a book, Behind the Green Mask, and she's done a lot of good work on this, and she's like a liberal Democrat lesbian or something.
Well, that's why she has like some of the credibility. I think she does, because she comes from that. And I have to say, she sounds exactly like somebody from the Bay Area.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt in my mind she is who she says she is.
Yeah.
At least on some levels.
But that's I mean,
you have also the tiny house movement, so-called movement in big brackets there.
Yeah, you have.
That's just because people are broke. I mean, I think that's
a manufactured house, but woke.
Yeah.
But it's like
but they push it in the culture. They have those they have TV programs about it and everything.
Yeah. I mean, talk about TV programs.
They try to make it.
You want to talk about demoralizing? You watch like these home networks where they say their price range is $2 million. Your budget. You're watching this, like this young couple is 28 and they're buying a $2 million home. You're like, what the? And what all that's boosting the consumerism stuff and these things, like I mean, I think obviously with Agenda 21, and I think you talked about it regular how these things can be pushed. Like when I thought, was it your Q&A program where you're talking about Silicon Valley, how Google, and obviously Google has ties to the intelligence community. These things, its funding I think started from them, but it's when you type in a search for inventors.
Oh yeah.
And
if you type in American inventors,
you
get the guy who made the peanut
that
and all
they
his
still
relatives.
haven't they're aware of this. They're well aware by now. It's active propaganda that nobody wants to be the person to fix it.
Yeah. Okay. The American, they're like, okay, wow, they're all, Fred, you get, the peanut guy and who quite frankly, I didn't recognize the other.
Actually, I don't know any of those.
Peanuts, mash them up.
I don't think Thomas Edison was in there.
If you type in white babies and white couples, it's even more viscerally offensive because you truly see the agenda at play. But, Agenda 21, from Rosa Corey's argumentation, is mainly about urbanization of the population and depopulation of rural areas.
Yeah.
She doesn't go into any of the racial stuff or any of the imperial stuff or anything like that. But and I think that's fair given her background. Her background was working for the California Department of Transportation, I think. And so her job was basically to go up to people and negotiate a price when they declared eminent domain on them if they wanted to build a road or something. So it was in her doing that she saw the patterns in the land usage regulations that made her sort of think that there was just something behind all this. And then she kept seeing sort of like similar institutions, which I can't remember specifically, but she is she's an impressive source on.
I think one was like ICLEI, the International Council of Local Initiatives, and they gives the facade of being a local initiative, but they're being bribed more or less by New World Order money. This gets into the whole so the occult banking and financial sector where this money can just pour in, and it's very easy to buy for a local politician to carry out an initiative. And what it is Sophia Smallston has done some work on this about local initiatives, how a pool or a community center will cost twice as much as it should be. So there's a whole lot of fraud going on there. But these initiatives,
She also looks like somebody who would fit in like Berkeley, California, or something.
Yeah, she's very.
I don't really know.
Yeah, she's very.
That's where she's from. She's a lesbian.
She is. Okay,
yeah.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah,
I
like her, or at least I've liked some of her work for sure. But
she makes these speculative observations, which are I think of some validity. One was this the drug war that pharmacist that was caught up, and sort of the incentives they have that local police have for sort of running up charges against someone because they get more funding if they bust a drug lab. So they went into this guy's house and found precursors that pretty much you could have in any household and call it a drug lab. And once they bust the drug lab, they get more funding, law enforcement. And this is a function of the drug war. And this is part of that local corruption that you were talking about earlier, how these things, there's an incentive for these things, just like there's an incentive for a riot for the police to pull out on the 1033 program. So there's a reason why perhaps on a balmy Friday night, the attorney, the prosecutor might announce that they're not indicting a cop, for shooting Michael Brown. And they have a riot and they can roll out the hardware which justifies another year of federal funding for their tanks. And so
the Department of Homeland Security grants.
Yeah, and so so police have a stake in sort of creating trouble, or at least making a riot seem bigger than it perhaps should be, or creating conditions where there is indeed a riot, playing on local antagonism or problems in these things, and so that's why sort of an unruly mob is always helpful for the oligarchs in the cities, because they're very easily stirred,
and they're just easier to watch. I mean, it's like you can't get out of a city, in a hurry if everybody else is trying to. So it's like a containment zone almost. And then there's some other theories out there which I don't have any hard evidence on, but it's sort of it fits a logical sort of train of thought. Beyond that, I can't really prove it. But the one theory that I've kind of paid some attention to, just because it's such a profound, outcome if it's true, is the one put forward by Joel Skousen, who's been on Alex Jones a few times. If anybody is able to still watch that, obviously, because you have to go to Infowars.com. But basically, he says, because he did this for a while. I mean, he was a U.S. Marine Corps pilot, and then he got into fallout shelter design and everything like that. And he's Mormon, so he sort of has that prepper culture imbued in him. And his, I think his father or grandfather, Cleon Skousen, was big in John Birch Society and a lot of the sort of skepticism about communist infiltration in the U.S. government. But he basically says that the Cold War never ended, which I think is one kind of a big plank to walk out on. And he basically said that it was sort of a fake out on the part of the Russians, that they ended the Soviet Union, but what they did was they went underground. Okay, if you believe that, that's one thing, but you don't necessarily have to believe that. The second part, though, which I think is perhaps more interesting and perhaps more tied into this Agenda 21 stuff, is that if the world is just getting too crowded and there's just too much discord, one thing you might consider, if you're Henry Kissinger and just in charge of all the Council of Foreign Relations people and people like that, one thing you could do is you could precipitate another great world war. And the way you do that is you basically get, it's almost like the Skynet scenario where they launch at Russia and then Russia retaliates. You basically cause the superpowers to shoot at each other. And then the military people, the elite, who are sort of going to all these really strange occult parties and things like that, they're given instructions to go into their underground bunkers, wait it out, and then when all the missiles have fired and all the sort of radioactive fallout is drifted away, they basically emerge and they declare there is now a world government, because we can no longer trust the individual nations with the armament that is now possible to be launched to be distributed in an independent way. So we have to have a centralized government. And the theory is that will have to be the case for the average Joe, because he's just been nuked, and whoever survived is going to be desperate if they're not in the know. And so they're going to accede to this government, and that accomplishes two things. One, it depopulates the planet, which is getting really crowded. Maybe not in the way that we like it, but it's just, or we would like more of our people to have more children. But the fact is, the planet itself is just having so many people. It's putting a lot of pressure on resources. And so you solve that problem with this great war. And the other problem is that now you have total control and everything because you're in the elite. That's his theory. And he really seems to take it seriously. And I think it's quite fascinating because it seems to fit into some of these things. But it is a little speculative. So
yeah,
that's one thing I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I did a show a while back with the Collins brothers about the H.G. Wells and the superweapon, the A-bomb, and how the fear of nuclear war drove the creation of the atom bomb and proliferation of the atom bomb. And the idea was it was going to create the pretext for world government through the management of these nuclear weapons. And they didn't quite get their way in the 1940s and 50s because of Stalin and these things. Stalin didn't quite cooperate. But this contributed to some of the, like the spy cases in the 1950s. The Rosenbergs and these things. How there was a faction within the American establishment that wanted global control of nuclear weapons, and then there was also the Pax Americana view of American domination. But the idea was that these weapons would provide a pretext for breaking down sovereignty in these things. Of course, the interpretation of World War II, even World War I, because you had the League of Nations, but World War II and the United Nations, as many people at the time saw it as sort of a prelude to world government. But the idea was that it was nationalism and nation states which created these wars, and therefore we needed to come together under a world body. And I believe was the scion of the Warburg family in the 1940s said in front of a Senate committee, he goes, "Well, we'll have world government whether we get it by consent or otherwise." Now I don't know what time frame he was talking about. These people, often their time horizons are rather long, so decades or a century or so. But yeah, that's similar to what that theory is, that the nuclear weapons themselves were created, so this ultimate weapon to create a pretext for world government, because you can't trust it, a government with these weapons and these things. So.
It is a pretty good argument for world government, to be honest.
Oh, sorry, we created the weapons.
I have to say it. I mean, I mean, I don't know if are you familiar at all with the work of very peculiar intellectual Jason Rezajani?
No.
Okay, I'll link it later. He wrote an interesting book in favor of world government from another perspective. But yeah, I mean, we definitely don't want the current, Judeo-Masonic power elite to have world government. Obviously not. But
there's one thing, going back to Agenda 21, is that there's a similarity that I in Agenda 21, under the pretext of conservation or false scarcity, is the what they did in Africa, with what's his name, the former SS guy, Bernhardt. The Conservation League and these things, how they carved out large swaths of land territory in Africa under the guise of conservation, and this is a pretext for them gaining control of these resources. This was a large driver for the conservation movement in the early 20th century. Murray Rothbard actually did a lot of work on this, how obviously if you ward off huge swaths of raw materials or resources from the market, what you control becomes more valuable. And this is why you had this large conservation movement. You saw a little bit of this in the sort of the manipulation of resources or energy resource and these things you can do under the guise of conservation. You remember under the Clinton administration, that scandal with the Grand Staircase, where Clinton just with an executive order made this coal that was out west, it was clean burning. He kept it from being mined. And this raised the value of coal. I think that was coming in, was it from Indonesia or something? He'd gotten a big donation or something. So this sort of how the political corruption can be exposed, but how, again, under the guise of conservation, you can serve the interest of a certain oligarch interests by closing off area resources from people using them. The same way the Rockefellers, I think, protected the Grand Tetons using government power,
That's what the Sierra Club does.
Yeah. So and actually they have like sell licensing or rights to like some of the land they own now in Louisiana, gas and stuff. So they're making money off leases and things like that. So it's a big money operation.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So, but yeah, so with Agenda 21 is under the guise of conservation or sustainable development, right, or smart cities and these things. At the same time, they're imposing Skynet on everybody because everyone's being monitored and controlled because they live in smart cities and these things, and they're ushering in driverless cars, self-driving cars, and these things, and all the conveniences of life that we have now, with thermostats that set themselves, or smart meters that bombard us with electromagnetic radiation, it reports our energy usage, how much water we're using, and even with our discount cards, we buy everything electronically, so everything we eat is being monitored in these things. And this will, at some point, it's going to link into insurance rates and things like that. So
one thing I tend to disagree, I get in disagreements with other people on the right about, is that I think a lot of these are questions, though, that would have needed to have been addressed regardless. And the problem that we have is the current oligarchy, the current would-be world controllers are the wrong people to address them. But ideas like the United Nations or the European Union, some kind of organization to prevent further European wars, or some way to crack down on wide-scale ecological catastrophes, etc. I think these are problems that would have to be addressed, but they're being addressed again by the wrong people.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's ecological problems, there's environmental problems, but it's usually not the ones that we hear about, right? I mean,
right.
There's real problems like with fracking, I think, right? And there's obviously, what are they putting in the water? So there's real environmental issues, but it's not going to be solved by some being lectured at by a college student about using straws, right? But that's what gets everyone excited. Why are we so dependent on petrochemicals to begin with, right? When such things like hemp-based material could provide.
Well, we did a whole show on that. I mean, it's we're by no means industry veterans, but I think the main reason petrochemicals are very useful is that they just store energy so well, and they're very dense forms of energy storage. When you're talking about what you can make from them out in terms of plastics and pharmaceuticals, you can find natural alternatives for that, obviously. But I think in terms of the transportation sector, I think it still has a place at the moment.
Oh yeah, I mean, but I think its dominance, the whole force behind prohibition was to marginalize ethanol in the early part of the 20th century. And,
well, Rockefeller did have a role in that. He had his best friend, I think, appointed to the president of the Anti-Saloon League. Yes. And there's probably something to the theory that he didn't want distillers homebrewing their own fuel for their vehicles.
Yeah, and it was, I think Ford's idea was and farmer could buy a Model T and you could fuel it with the plants growing outside his house there.
The apple down the road.
Yeah,
that will be the future of the car. Yep.
But that decentralizes things. You see, as how do you put a meter on that? And so it's all about.
It really is like we're ruled by the Ferengi or something. I mean, if you're a Deep Space Nine fan, but yeah, it's frightening. It's frightening.
They could centralize and control things, and that's how you do. That's the problem with a lot of these things, because a lot of the way that we live and the consumer items we've become used to is so much that is a product of sort of the skullduggery that we accept as normal. This goes back to what you were saying earlier about we just kind of accept it. We're like fish swimming in water. We don't really know we're in water, and because we're used to it. It's the status quo. It's the normal thing, So we don't really question it. People don't question it.
Right.
People will look at Rockefeller as a captain of industry and these things, and he's successful, and the right will defend him. There's a lot of tendency among libertarians to defend these industrialists as great.
I used to. I did too. And the reason was when I was growing up, there just didn't seem to be anything to look up to other than these people who are like these captains of industry, in my opinion. I didn't trust the politicians at all. And when Obama says, ironically, you didn't build that. Well, you didn't build anything, Obama. What the hell did you build? You basically just got appointed by whatever deep state faction got you into power, and you never invented anything, and et cetera, et cetera. But I would always see this sort of especially in the technology industry. I mean, you can't claim that like Apple and Microsoft didn't like create their products. I mean, sure, Xerox created a lot of what they sort of ended up developing, but nonetheless, like these people were creating things for the first time, and I always saw that as sort of a very admirable thing in society. They were creating solutions, even if they may not be macro solutions. They're sort of micro solutions, and I admire those types, and I do appreciate the person who can organize something as complicated as a global oil company.
Yeah.
Obviously, it takes a lot of intelligence and just ability to work with complicated systems. But the problem that I didn't understand was that people who are often in those positions are willing to exploit others, and that's sort of cliched, but I was under the impression that people who were in business were operating under the philosophy of win-win, and I think a lot of them ended up basically just like, well, as long as I win, I don't care what the other guy ends up having. And that's the problem I have with a lot of anybody in power, is that they're willing to be extractive and destructive, frankly.
Isn't that the ethos that's pushed in the business schools now? Sort of the ruthless exploitation, bottom line. It's sort of the Newtonian world applied, where morality doesn't play into these things. Values.
Well, in practice, it is, but in sort of their, because they require ethics classes in MBA programs now after I think the Enron scandal. That's when it started, and basically they try to play that down. But the truth is, I mean, you go to your boss and you make money for him. No matter how many people you stepped over, he's going to typically keep you around. That's how it works.
Well, libertarians have a sort of confused and sometimes schizophrenic attitude towards money power. Because you mentioned Princess Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard had some very good critiques of money power. He wouldn't have called it as such, but if you read his Wall Street, Banks and Foreign Policy, this kind of thing, they can acknowledge the extent to which it's these industrialists and capitalists who are effectively deciding state policy. And they come to this bizarre conclusion that you could, if you magically did away with the state, then these people would only be acting in a way that is, beneficial to all, etc. I've always that was my main disillusionment with libertarianism.
Isn't libertarians often kind of have this rhetorical tick where they kind of do the same thing that shit-tier socialists do, where they ascribe everything evil to the state or capitalism, respectively, and it just becomes this kind of this metonym for anything that they find distasteful, that it's somehow the fault of this metaphysical entity.
This is why both libertarians and Marxists look forward to the erosion or disappearance of the state in their final outlook on things.
Well, yeah, Marx's final vision of things was fundamentally libertarian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot metaphysically in common as far as the materialism and the individualism of both outlooks.
Well, that's what
your kind of academic Marxists tend to, I don't know, at least play at taking things a little bit more seriously than this. But your DSA to your Chapo Trap House crowd, they'll cheerfully ascribe the failures of the Soviet regime to state capitalism.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, then I guess I got this from the book "Fires in the Minds of Men."
Oh yeah, the Billington, right?
In Billington's book, how
I haven't read that. That's a good book.
The atomization of the left, of the right rather, sort of the libertarian atomized view of things, and the socialized collectivist view of the left, had the same destination, which is sort of a barren materialist view of reality. And in the process, the institutions that really protect us, that feed us, that nurture us, and really provide for a healthy community are destroyed. And we see that both in international capitalism and also international communism. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they both emerged from the same area, which is the city of London.
Right.
So that's the dialectic that a lot of libertarians or right wingers and left wingers don't get. Is that this is part of it? Is this sort of a dialectic that's being played out?
Well, this is why I am at the end of the day an unapologetic statist, and I think that the institutions that are needed to protect a healthy culture need to be well beyond the economic, well beyond the marketplace. I mean, we've talked, for instance, about the destructive nature of something like pornography, and libertarians is another area where they're very schizophrenic about it. They want they are unwilling to understand the ways in which these kinds of forces of social decay make people better subjects, to be ruled by a tyrant, and they instead they want to defend the pornography, and it's of course not a coincidence the heavy Jewish involvement in libertarianism and the corresponding Jewish involvement in pornography. That those things aren't coincidental. I mean, one of the biggest defenders of pornography would be someone like Walter Block,
and he may not even be conscious of it. But yeah, the penchant for subversion.
I mean, at the end of the day, I think Walter Block, I think he means well from where he's coming from. I think that if someone like Walter Block was able to have political power, it would be a nightmare. I mean, I guess he would say he wouldn't want political power or something to that effect. But still, I mean, if his worldview was to win out or become materialize as our reality, it would be a hellscape.
Well, that was the problem with Ron Paul, bless his heart. I mean, I think he's a true believer, and I think he's a genuinely good man. But he was sort of, and John McCain just died. They ironically called him the Maverick, but I mean, he worked with the insiders on a lot of things, and it was basically Ron Paul was just up there sort of talking into the wind as the Congress was sort of looking at their eyes. He was speaking to a public that barely understood what he was talking about, because he would go into these very complex concepts of how the Fed was making the economy overheating and malinvested and all this. And it was really just a very small segment of academic and financial nerds that really followed really what he was talking about. And I think his problem was he just ultimately was not able to garner a power base. And when you saw in the 2012 presidential primaries on the Republican side how the Republicans treated him, they viewed him the same way. He just was not a viable political candidate because he couldn't garner that power base. And that's really what it's about in politics. It's power. Libertarians are about distributing power, and that is something that just doesn't work when you have actors who are willing to work together in the political sphere, which is reality. And that's the problem of the libertarian approach. It's just not going to survive in a competitive landscape on the political domain. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's again. I remember talking. He'd pull out a dime and go, "I can make a dime, a gallon of gasoline, a dime again." And of course, his point was a solid currency. He goes, now the dime was worth whatever the gallon of gasoline was. But people are like,
and
what?
he was correct.
And he was correct.
I completely agree with him. That's the sort of frustrating thing, is that it's not sufficient to be correct. You have to have power in order to implement things. And people are just not that good-natured. I'm very much a cultural Catholic in that sense. I don't think we're inherently good. I think we're just inherently the way we are, and it's not going to be typically a very altruistic or cooperative way of being. It's basically going to be a very primitive, very survival of the fittest mindset that I think we're just evolved for. I think that's how people are. We're very selfish.
Well, I think people need guidance and they need prescription, which is very anti-liberal, right? They need certain traditions and customs to guide them in these things, and we live in a society which kind of frowns upon that. We see the individual. Ironically, we're told we're very the individual is paramount, but at the same time, that our liberties are being increasingly narrowed by regulations and taxes and these things. This is the ultimate I guess the contradiction of the liberal world order is it brings in a state which is far more, smothering and crushing than any absolute monarch of yore. And even the libertarians write about
Hans
that.
Hermann Hoppe.
Yeah. Just look at the size of government.
They came to the they came to the correct conclusion. Well, some did. I mean, Hoppe, he won't come out and advocate for an actual state because he's still hung up in his particular dogma of private property, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But they did come to some understanding of the fact that in order to secure freedom, you need power. And by freedom, I mean freedom in the true sense, freedom to actualize your human potentials,
Mm-hmm.
your freedom to have a proper family, etc., and not freedom to consume pornography or to take heroin or whatever.
Yeah, because
well, as strong as you want they want to wish away power, and they don't want to understand that power could be used to secure a healthy society, to a healthy culture.
Yeah,
it doesn't need to be overbearing.
Yeah, I'm reading a book called Liberty, the God That Failed. And he talks about how, ironically, he talks about, it's a traditional Catholic writing it, and he's talking about kind of defending the confessional states. Of course, confessional states are anti-liberal, but he's saying how, ironically, the writing of John Locke, it's a confessional state too. It's just a confessional state for liberalism. But John Locke did not believe in freedom for Catholics because they were not trustworthy. So then again, he's turned around, and it's the same way the Catholic would say that a Protestant or a heathen is not trustworthy and they need to be regulated. So it's the same argument. You just believe in a different confessional state. But he's talking about in the book how really is under the guise of liberty, what happens is society loses the institutions, the mediating institutions that really defend our interests, that we can identify with, that we can organize under. It destroys those, lays everything flat, and all you have is individual rights, and also you do it with the idea of a moral order, a moral, objective moral order, and that's the oligarchs thrive in that because they no longer even have the moral order to restrain them. All you have is power.
Nisbet made the same argument.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's one of the things, because this gets into what you were talking, when early part of our conversation, the myth of America is liberty. But liberty is another term for power, which is what he writes in the book, Liberty, the God That Failed. Liberty is just another term for power. And under that scenario, only a few are going to wield power, but except they're going to wield power with no restriction, no sense of restrictions, restraint or anything, which is what we have today with the oligarchs.
Yeah, they don't have skin in the game, and they're hidden. Power should be exercised openly rather than surreptitiously. That way, there's the ability to hold accountable your rulers, even if that requires pitchforks and torches or whatever.
Hello?
Oh, did I cut out? Hello?
Is Adam still there?
Adam?
Hank, are you there?
I am here.
Oh,
I think
okay.
we just lost Adam. Yes, we did just lose Adam here.
Oh, okay. That's strange.
He may have been having funky internet issues.
Let's see here. Should I try to call him back?
Yeah, let's see if we can add him to the call.
3 or 4 in call. That's fine. I have so I have 3. So I lost. So how do I do that without cutting you all off?
Well, I just hit the add thing and attempted to dial him in.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Looks like that may not have been effective. Okay, he says through a side channel that Skype booted him.
Oh, okay. So he's out of Skype. Okay,
that looks like it. Yeah, he's not showing us online anymore in Skype either.
Okay, because my screen color changed on Skype. I'm now live with Power with Crowder. Is that you?
Yeah, that's my email. Yeah.
Okay. And Adam, 3 or 4 on call. Okay. So,
Well,
where do we go from here?
I will have to take off in a little bit here. I have sort of a long day planned for tomorrow.
Okay, I'll let you go.
Did Adam say that he was going to be able to hop back on?
Hey,
Oh, he did. Oh, there he is.
hey
Yeah.
guys, sorry.
Okay. So, okay. So,
Well, yeah, since we're already in kind of an intermission, let's plan out how we want to, where we want to conclude, have a final discussion.
okay, let's, any final thoughts?
Well, where were we? Geez.
Liberty. We're talking about liberty.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry if that was directed at me or you guys.
No, I noticed that that the something funny on Skype, but visually, and said, "Oh, then you hadn't said anything," so I figured you might have been cut off or something.
Yeah,
the screen
it's
changed.
my router. I had to reconnect my Wi-Fi, but we're okay now.
So, the myth of the 20th century. What? I mean, obviously, the 20th century. What people say it started with World War One.
Well, death of Queen Victoria, or World War One, kind of is the modern era per se.
When the Titanic sunk or something, I don't know. The end of an era. It's a La Belle Epoque, as they call it. So, if you were to, okay, how do? What's the biggest myth of the 20th century? I know it's a loaded question. Well, what would you say is if you were to pick at one thing at the 20th century you could revise that everyone understand, what would you pick that out? One thing. I know I'm putting you on the spot. So if I can always edit this out if you don't like it.
You are not a number. You are a free man.
Good. I like that. Okay. Nick, what's your biggest myth?
I thought Hank, are you still here? Are you gonna?
Oh, Hank,
I am. Sorry, there's a blip there, but I am still here.
Well, I mean, to me, I would frame a positive myth that should have. I see the 20th century struggle as the rule of the superior by the inferior is the main thing, and the use of the inferior on the bottom by the inferior on the top against the superior in the middle.
You're saying the destruction of excellence, of the destruction of quality, quantity over quality, which you could say that's modernity, isn't it? Quantity over quality.
Well, that's what Rene Gagnon would say. Yes.
Yeah.
Bronze Age Ferber talks about this in his recent book, Bronze Age Mindset. I'll make a quick plug for myself. I've been given the honor of actually reading his audiobook, which is forthcoming. But the point he makes is that clearly there's something wrong when you have a slightly overweight, extremely awkward and strange Mark Zuckerberg talking to Congress in his sort of robot voice about how he is the protector and guardian of people's privacy and truth at the same time. And he is even in that position to be giving that talk. When I was sort of growing up, the Hollywood sort of the day was still portraying the sort of action hero as sort of the type of person that was going to be the hero. And now we have the nerd as the sort of new archetype of the controller of our society. And the expense and the cost is very clear in terms of the aesthetic, the sort of psychological, just the certain terms of like having any pride in your society. I mean, just look at our people. We're overweight. We're sort of we don't understand geography. We don't have an understanding what our own government is doing around the world, let alone to our own people. And so we're just a very ignorant, overfed bunch of cattle that are being led by these very strange, nebbish type people. Whereas if I were to live in a society that had sort of a very, let's say, not so kind ruler, but had sort of the affect of a a strong aesthetic Greek god in the terms of like what Bap would talk about, that would be a more impressive society. And I think that gets to what Nick is talking about, is that we have these sort of very inferior people using the sort of masses to crush, a lot of the good in the middle.
Yeah, and a lot of it's the function of technology, where physicality and strength doesn't matter anymore. Yeah,
and just basic aesthetics, which is just not appreciated enough.
Sitting in air-conditioned trailers, flying killer robots halfway across the world to blow up an Afghan wedding.
Yeah, I mean, and look at our architecture. I mean, there's just there's nobody who's going to go to the United States to visit a suburban tract housing lot versus the equivalent in Europe, which took centuries to put together with cobblestone and just personal touches and the concept of I'll have to paraphrase. I don't remember the exact quote, but it's basically, in good societies, old men plant trees not for themselves but for their grandchildren. I think today it's a very fast-paced culture where we're basically building these ugly McMansions, and even the term itself implies what our culture's become. It's a McDonald's culture.
Yeah.
These repulsive-looking artifacts on the landscape, which are not designed to last, and are going to be demolished and bulldozed with the next financial crisis. And so it's just a sad society.
One of my favorite books from E. Michael Jones was his book on Bauhaus, The Living Machines.
Oh, on Gropius. Yeah, I read that. Was a good one. Yeah, and the architecture and explain why that's such good. That's a good book.
Well, it's keeping in this theme with it's the elevation of ugliness to suppress beauty. It's treating man as the man machine rather than as a spiritual being. Mm-hmm. Because a spiritual being is capable of greatness and true greatness and true beauty and these things are a threat to the ugly Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. I mean, not that there aren't people way more powerful than Mark Zuckerberg, but as an archetype for the kind of people who would like to rule us. And what they need to do in order to do so, they need to crush, people of higher gifts in order to maintain their power, and they're happy to see the world burn. These are not people who should have power, and the possibilities for catastrophe with these people, in charge of nuclear weapons. And we went on our detour about Agenda 21. Mm-hmm. This is where their mind starts to go with how do we deal with populations, etc. Well, we're going to maybe have to pull the trigger and go in our specially designed bunkers and live out the Mad Max apocalypse or whatever it is.
Yeah, that kind of show that crackpot realism, our mineshaft gap. We have a mineshaft gap, as in Dr. Strangelove. But yeah, the living machines and the idea of this modern architecture was it wasn't designed to conform to nature's laws, and therefore is dysfunctional. The flat roofs, the problems with which he points out in that book, and not only the dispiriting quality of the architecture, particularly the high-rise tenement houses that he talks about, the social engineering function that it served. But the idea that you can create this dysfunctional architecture, which is ripe with problems, leaking and these things, but nevertheless they build it. It's the same way with their ideology. It goes against nature, and it's ripe with problems and never works, but they insist on enforcing it and carrying it out because it's part of their ideology. They want a war against nature. They don't want to be consistent with nature or logos.
And it's an expression of their own internal ugliness as well.
Yeah.
That's what truly spiritually ugly people do. They try to smash. They see something beautiful and they want to smash it.
Hence the Rockefeller support for modern art.
Right. I mean, exactly. Modern art was we see this now with the claiming, fatties are beautiful, or that a man in a dress is a beautiful woman, or this kind of garbage. And I think that's really the main current I see. We talked about the ways in which you weaken a culture and that you weaken a people, and that makes them easier to rule. I think that's the main power in the 20th century, and the main lie is that these things are things of beauty when they're anything but.
Yeah, and that's the whole lie of the cult of equality, where, I mean, to make everyone equal, you got to destroy all the beautiful, everything that excels, everything that's great, and obviously, the nature of things is we aren't all equal. In fact, that's the great thing about it is we're very different, and we can trade with each other, and we can be enriched by watching other people excel, as opposed to being envious of those people.
Jealousy is 'tis the green-eyed monster that doth mock the meat it feeds on.
Yep. Hank, did I get you?
Well, I think I don't know. Maybe it's maybe the best way to think about the 20th century is the American society starting to come to grasp with the idea that it actually needs to rule itself and not rely on a kind of ever-providing hand of God for its sustenance, but that it actually needs to rely not on the fruits that it was bestowed with ab initio, but actually make something of itself.
I mean, and then there's the what do you call it? What's the statutory? The American civic religion. I mean, we talked earlier about that's what Albert J. Nock called it, and we talked about the economic incentives to keep the middle class invested in the system, but there's also the emotional. I mean, people at the end of the day, they have trouble. They don't want to believe that their government is as evil and corrupt as it actually is, and they don't want to believe that these wars are shams, and they're all the American military culture. We're getting the good guys, right? And that comes back to the good war. That's extended to every other good war that's taken place, but you had the big one, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the big one with the biggest lies, right?
Yes.
Because you got to justify it.
Onward, Christian soldiers.
Mm-hmm. So, well, folks, I think we covered it for the night. I know you mentioned you all have lives, so we gonna call it a night.
Oh no, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Tim. Maybe we could have you on our program. I wrote it down somewhere. An idea occurred to me of a topic that I thought you would be
okay.
The perfect person for, but I'd have to dig it up.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having us on.
Hank, thanks. Nick, sorry, Adam?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
thank you. It's an honor to be on your show.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. That's Hank, Adam, and Nick from Myth of the 20th Century. It's a weekly podcast?
Yes.
Yes.
Comes out every Wednesday and typically Thursday now on MP3 only on the latter part. So we do a video on Wednesday on YouTube, and then Thermidor hosts our MP3s on Thursday.
Okay, that's where we can find it on YouTube and Thermidor?
And Thermidor, yes.
Okay, excellent. And yeah, I guess you've done two recent shows on the 6-Day War and also the USS Liberty, which are related topics, of course.
Yeah.
So I guess you'll be next couple of days, a few days, you'll be putting out a new show.
Yes, it's also on Zionism.
Oh, okay.
Funny enough.
Continue.
Yeah, we'll be getting into the progressive era the week after that.
Oh, okay, interesting. Great. And so basically people can find it. Best place to go would be YouTube, and for the time being, and Thermidor.
Yes, you bet.
That is correct.
Okay, and of course then you have your website though, right? Because I just Googled Myth of 20, it comes up. So.
Yeah, myth20c.com.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I'll let you all go for the evening. Thanks a lot for spending so much time with me. I'll post this soon. When I do, I'll send you the link. And we'll go from there.
Thinking about the times you drove in my car, thinking that I might have drove you too far. told you about the swans that they live in the park. And I told you about our kid, now he's married to Mabel. Yes, I told you that the light goes up and down. Don't you notice how the wheels go round? And you better pick yourself up from the ground before they bring the curtain down. Yes, before they bring the curtain down. Hey! Talking about the girl who looks quite like you. Said she had the time to wait